My name is Heather Tick. I'm an integrative physician, which means medically I like to use all available strategies and techniques to help my patients, regardless of whether they're conventional or what we've been calling complementary alternative. I work in the pain department at the University of Washington. Okay, that's me. That's my disclosure. I've authored a book. And there are a couple of academic papers that have recently come out in case you're interested in integrative strategies for pain and cultural transformation, specifically in pain, but in medicine in general. So today we're here to talk about inflammation and its influence on health and its influence on disease and what things we can do to influence it in our direction. And so when we're talking about medical issues, it's very important from my perspective to look at the difference between acute and chronic. Acute medicine is where conventional medicine is stellar. It is where we have had miracles, from antibiotics to many of the surgeries we know how to do, to emergency medicine, to saving life and limb with many brilliant strategies. And it is in trying to apply the same principles that we've used in acute medicine to chronic conditions. That's where we run into more difficulty because they don't apply as directly as you'll see. So in conventional medicine, what we have is what I like to call a game of connect the dots. So we try and collect enough features about the patient in front of us, whether it's blood tests, electrodiagnostics, x-rays, MRIs, all sorts of specific things. When we collect enough of them, we say, okay, I have a diagnosis. And then we go from there. And the diagnosis really underpins our system. Our system can't work without a diagnosis because you need it to book an appointment, to bill an appointment, to write your medical chart. It's how we talk to each other. And so those are the kinds of things that we have in our connect the dots repertoire. So if I say to you, I'm thinking of a tree, you have some idea of what I'm thinking of. But, do you really? Am I thinking of a pine tree, an oak tree, a baobab? What kind of a tree am I thinking of? Well, that's the same thing that diagnosis is. It's conceptual thought. And when we say tree, we can't go through life experiencing every single tree as a unique entity. We'd never get down the street because we'd be too busy experiencing the texture and the color and everything. And it's the same in medicine. It's hard to experience every single phenomenon for what it is. But it is important to remember that when we are giving a diagnosis, we're missing some essential individual variables in that unique patient in front of us. Now again, when you're dealing with acute medicine, it's extremely important to use an algorithm to arrive at the diagnosis and then another one to treat the diagnosis. Because you're in the emergency room and somebody's there with chest pain, and you have to figure out really quickly, is this a heart attack, a dissecting aortic aneurysm, an ulcer, heartburn, a back issue? And you need to know that quickly. And by going through that algorithm, yes, you'll miss a few, but you'll save far more lives than you lose and harm. Whereas in chronic conditions, the opposite is true. And if we just go with the diagnosis and ignore some of the individual variabilities, we actually cause a lot of harm. And so the other thing I like to look at, other than connecting the dots, is these were supposed to do that on their own. They were supposed to go with their own timing. So what are the connectors? I have to learn more about animation. It worked on my computer. What about the connectors? So what are some of the connectors? Actually, that's kind of a list of the connectors. And so there are many things in medicine, the connection with community, mind-body, sleep, rest, inflammation. Those are some of the connectors that we have to look at. And we can really take our notes from the laws of physics. So when you look at the atom at the micro level, what you have is the diameter of an atom. It's very tiny, 10 to the minus 10th meters. And the nucleus is 10 to the minus 15th. And all of the cloud of electrons around it are so tiny that you can actually ignore them, said the physicist who gave me these figures. And so what you have then is the atom is mostly made up of empty space. Why then do we look solid? Why then is this table solid? Why don't I fall through the floor? It's mostly space. And it's the connectors. It's the connections between all of those items that are, all of those solid bits, those dots, that are filling up that empty space. And in physics terms, in anatomic terms, it's an electromagnetic force that holds it all together. That's why we can walk over bridges. And the same holds true of the macro level. So when astronomers describe the universe, they talk about all the distinct items, the planets, the stars, the black holes, the pulsars, that they are actually all connected with a spider web of forces that they say are gravitational and rotational forces, orbital forces, that hold it all together, that causes one dot at the far end of the universe to influence another at the very far end of it, and that the whole thing is connected energetically. So let's talk about chronic disease. Chronic disease is where we spend all our money in healthcare. It's where I spend most of my time in healthcare. Now, when you're going through medical school, you spend about 90% of your time learning about the conditions that you're going to spend 5% of your practicing. That's the sad reality of it. Now, there are a few super specialists who are going to go into the field of those very rare diseases, and they will spend their time there, but the vast majority of us do not. 7 out of 10 diseases 7 out of 10 deaths, rather, are caused by chronic diseases. And we have an epidemic of chronic diseases. Most people, 1 out of nearly half of all people, have at least one chronic disease, and many of them have more. And we're certainly spending a lot of money on it. So a model for chronic disease is the agouti mouse. So the little mouse that you're seeing on the left, that's the orange-colored one, that's Mama. And she is genetically identical to all the other agouti mice. They are an example of how we study diabetes. So she is insulin resistant, she has diabetes, she has this orange-colored coat, and she's obese. And all of her clones, all of the other clones like her, are absolutely identical. So what some researchers did one day is they fed this Mama, while she was pregnant, B vitamins. And what came out was the other little mouse, her daughter, the brown one, on the right-hand side. Now, genetically, they're still identical. The genome is the same. What happened? Something changed the genetic code. No, something modified the implementation of the genetic code, and it changed what happened. And then the other most interesting part of it, if you go back to this little mouse, that little brown mouse, when she was pregnant and had her children with no addition of B vitamins, she passed along her own body type. So this was an heritable change that happened with one generation having a nutritional change implemented. That change was then inherited by subsequent generations. Pretty powerful. Now, another thing we found out is we have here also 2 genetically identical mice. The only difference is the types of bacteria in their gut. And if you take the bacteria from one and give it to the other, what happens is the skinny one gets fat and the fat one gets skinny. So let's go back, 1908. Elie Metchnikoff won the Nobel Prize for discovering something called cellular immunity. It was a big year for the immune system that year because Paul Ehrlich won the Nobel Prize for the other side of the immune system, which is humoral immunity. Now, Metchnikoff also talked at the same time about the microbiome. He recognized that all of these microorganisms in our gut, in and around our body, actually are one of the major determinants of our health. And he even predicted that there would be fecal transplants, which is what happened to those two little mice, the one that was obese and the one that was skinny. And he recognized the impact of it. Unfortunately, that was 1908, and it is now 2016. And most, like 95% of the literature on this has been written in the last 15 years. Now just think of all the alterations that have happened between 1908 and now that have impacted what happens to the microbiome. Antibiotics, not only for disease but in our food, most of the pesticides that have been developed, the toxics, water has lead in it, fish have mercury in them. There are so many things that we have done to change sugar in our diet, to change how the microbiome can develop. It's very hard to understand now how we're going to figure out what an optimal microbiome is. We missed a great opportunity. So now let's talk about why we get diseases. So how much of our health outcome is determined by genetics? So let's have a poll. How many think it's 100%? How about 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, and 20, and let's go to 10. Okay, it's not going to be 0. So the majority of you figured it was around 50. It's actually 20 to 30%. That's it. 20 to 30% is determined by genetics. Yes, there are a few genetic diseases that if you get that gene, that's it. That determines your fate. But that's really the minority of the types of genetic code that we inherit. A full 70 to 80% is what we eat, drink, think, feel, and do. Our lifestyle. And that's great news. So let's talk a little about the microbiome. It has a profound effect on inflammation, our immune system, and our mood. It has 10 times as many cells as us, and 200 times as much DNA. There is, in our body, if we think of it from a genetic code perspective, there is more them than us in us. Now, this microbiome actually is it is lending us their genetics, because the genetics of the microbiome, we can utilize them for our benefit. The microbiome utilizes it for our benefit, because fortunately, all those little microbes are actually very beneficent. They look after us most of the time, unless we mess with them really badly. Okay. So let's go to inflammation. So I mentioned inflammation before and some of the chronic diseases. This is a list of some of the chronic diseases that we experience as a result of inflammation, and they are on the rise. Now, interesting book written by Martin Blaser called The Missing Microbes that you might want to see. He's also written some other academic works. And what he suggests here is that most, if not all, biologic processes that constitute the human health and disease are influenced by the microbiome. And this is because we have enough nerve cells in the gut to make a small mammal's brain. We have 70 to 80% of the immune system, which lines the gut. And we have, of course, our digestive system is right there, taking in nutrients. The detoxification system, one of the main tenets of our detoxification system, is right there, of course, in the gut. That's how we get rid of toxics in our body. So it's this confluence of all the major systems that determine our biology are right there. The nervous system in the gut communicates, we now know, with the brain instantaneously. It doesn't even have to wait for chemicals to get from one to the other. We don't have to digest our food and then have it get to the brain. There's an instantaneous connection that happens. It's pretty miraculous what we're discovering. So what's really important is this biodiversity of the microbiome in the gut. And we have lost a lot of this diversity. And this is a statement from Mayo Clinic's proceedings, that the diversity, the greater diversity, the more resilient we are in terms of assaults on our system. So if we have dietary indiscretions or if we get food poisoning, we recover better if we have a very diverse microbiome. But unfortunately, over the last 100 years, we have a less diverse microbiome. So this level of diversity that this child is getting in their microbiome is very infrequent in our culture. So I don't know, can you see there? There's a baby in a little rocky thing in a barn with a calf kind of looking over and sniffing at her. And so this richness of the microbiome is extremely important. And for one thing, we saw in the animal model, we saw that it relates to obesity. We now know that it does in humans as well. And this we are calling it the adaptive immune system, and it's influenced as the immune system develops as we grow. It's very influenced by the bacteria in the bowel. And this is a very interesting way of putting it, that the mammalian immune system, which appears to control microbes, so it's supposed to be there to defend us against viruses, bacteria that are pathogenic, but actually we are controlled by the microbes themselves. And so there's this very symbiotic relationship that goes on. And you know, we've been growing up in a setting where we want to sanitize everything. So everybody's using antibacterial soap and antibacterial mouthwash, and everything needs to be sterilized, and yet that's not to our advantage. Now, when you look at the developed world, we have all of these inflammatory diseases on the increase. This does not happen in the developing world, and so there's something called the hygiene theory of health that we'll talk about in a couple minutes. Now, the rate at which these diseases, these chronic inflammatory diseases, are rising in their prevalence, they're becoming much more common. The rate at which they're rising tells us it can't be genetic, because we're not changing our genome that quickly. It has to be those epigenetic changes. Now, in an experiment with 20 African Americans and 20 Africans from South Africa, they switched diets for 2 weeks. And what they found was that the American group, after 2 weeks of eating an African diet, which is much higher in whole foods, in fiber, much more calorie restricted, but nutrient dense, that they had less inflammation and fewer biomarkers that would indicate that they're at risk of getting colon cancer. And the African group did just the opposite. After 2 weeks of eating a standard American diet, they had increased markers that said they were at higher risk of getting cancer. That's what happens when we eat that diet all the time. Do you know what the acronym is for standard American diet? SAD, yes. So all of our antimicrobial strategies, well, you know, nobody wants polio and smallpox back, but we're getting rid of infectious and non-infectious microorganisms at the same time. Our antibiotics are pretty indiscriminate. And what happens is we are losing our association, our beneficial association with this rich world of microbes that could be and could really impact positively on our health. And this is just some examples. New onset Crohn's disease very often happens after taking antibiotics, especially in teenagers, which is when the highest incidence of developing that disease is. So changes in the intestinal microbiota may be an essential factor in numerous inflammatory diseases. And there is this interdependence of the bacteria and our immune system. It shapes our immune system. It's crucial. And this is one last quote from an article, that this dysregulation that's happening because of loss of the diversity, that many non-infectious human diseases such as autoimmunity, allergies, and cancer are on the rise. So basically, food is information. That's the main way we have that we can beneficially impact on our microbiome. And some are saying we shouldn't be too careful about trying to sterilize our food. So for example, we shouldn't be irradiating our food to get rid of all bacteria so that it has good shelf life. It may do fine on the shelf, it just doesn't do us very much good. And so we need to find ways of keeping our food supply safe without having to go to such extreme measures. There are places in the world that have a culture of food safety. So my daughter was living in Italy for a number of years with her husband who was in the Air Force. And the first visit I was there, we went to the organic grocery store and I picked up some organic eggs, and there on the eggs is written a sign saying these eggs are guaranteed not to have salmonella. And I kind of shook my head and thought, my goodness, that's quite the statement. But they take it very seriously with testing and enforcement. And we come back here to what I'm used to, and basically the FDA and USDA says assume that all eggs have salmonella and act accordingly. Don't ever eat a raw egg. I mean, those are diametrically opposed approaches to the problem of a safe food culture. The same week that I was in Italy, I had read an article there's an episode of flour, wheat flour, being contaminated with the pathogenic E. coli. So the pathogenic E. coli is the one that causes renal damage and can cause death. It's not the regular E. coli in our systems. It's the one that came into being when we began to force feed cows with grains. Cows don't normally eat grains. They eat grass. When they eat grass, they have more omega-3s, by the way, almost as much as fish. So we force-fed them grains because it made them fat quickly. They do that for about 6 weeks. Do you know why they don't do that for 7 weeks? Because they die. Because they become so inflamed and so sick that they will die. So here we have caused the development of this pathogenic E. coli, and they found it in flour. So the regulators said, oh my goodness, don't anybody eat any raw flour ever again. Now, anybody who has ever baked knows flour goes everywhere. How do you avoid any contamination with raw flour? So instead of saying, hey guys, there's cow poop in our flour, let's find a way of not having that, we issue a blanket statement saying, don't ever eat that. So, food is information. Now, sugar is in a lot of our food. 80% of our foods contain sugar in North America, and the highest level of sugar than anywhere else would allow. So for example, 20 ounces of a soda, of a Coke or Pepsi type soda in this country, doesn't have to be the colas, but in general, the sodas, the commercial ones, they have 20 ounces. How many teaspoons of sugar? Let's do another poll. 5 teaspoons, 10 teaspoons, 15 teaspoons, 20 teaspoons. It's 16. 16 teaspoons of sugar in 20 ounces of soda. In Europe, they don't allow that. I think they cap it at 11. But we have a very unique food regulation system here. So you change your body every time you eat. You either make it more inflamed or less inflamed. And if you eat this, we know that for the 8 to 12 hours after you eat it, you will be at higher risk of a heart attack and a stroke. And that's because of increased inflammation. Same goes for these. Both of these types of foods have high glycemic content because, of course, they put sugar in everything, including your French fries and your meat, commercially prepared. So high glycemic foods, what do? As I said at the beginning, it increases your risk of cardiovascular acute episodes, even if you do not have a genetic risk factor for it. So the food overcomes good genetics. It suppresses your postprandial leptin response. So leptin is the hormone that makes you know that you're full. You need to stop eating. If you're leptin resistant, which means you have a lower leptin response, you will keep eating. And so eating high glycemic foods makes you want to keep eating. But we all know that. You have one Oreo, you want 15. And then there's a reference here to a very full review of what high glycemic foods do to you in their connection with chronic disease. So this is a different type of diet. This is typical of the Mediterranean diet. Lots of vegetables, fruits, there's nuts, seeds, legumes, there's some pasta, there's some fish and a little bit of meat in there. There'll be cheese in there. Of course, there's wine. Let's not forget the wine, the olive oil, the healthy oils, avocados, things like that. And that is a diet that makes you more alkaline. Now, often there's a lot of confusion about what type of diet should I eat. And so some people say paleo, some people say vegan, vegetarian, alkaline. What's the difference between all of them? Mediterranean. When you look at all those diets, even though one is vegan and one is paleo, they resemble each other far more than any of them resemble the SAD diet. Because most of them depend mainly on vegetables. That's the common denominator, is plant food for all of these. As Michael Pollan says, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. Best 7-word quotation ever. And so if you eat a mainly plant-based diet, that's where most nutrition comes from. And it quelches the inflammation. It reduces inflammation. So we are what we eat, ingest, digest, and absorb, and how the microbiome reacts to it. So that's another key factor. And these are the things that damage the microbiome. So I've already given you a bit of a rant on sugar and processed foods. Aspartame and sucralose are the main commercial alternatives to sugar, and they are even worse than sugar. So aspartame, which is is, I can't even remember the names of them. Sucralose is Splenda. Aspartame is, it might be Sweet and Low, it's one of the other packages, but look at the ingredients when you get things like that. Aspartame turns into formaldehyde in your body. Formaldehyde is good for dead people. Sucralose is a chlorinated pesticide. That's what they were trying to develop when they made it. It's a sugar molecule with chlorine attached. And the chlorine gets absorbed into your tissues. It is not a health food. All of these went through great regulatory opposition initially, and it was politically mandated that they be approved. And you can connect those dots. Antibiotics. So 80% of the antibiotics that are used in this country are not for any disease. They go into our food supply because they fatten up animals. And even though that has been outlawed, it still happens, still 80%. Pesticides, carrageenan. Carrageenan was used at one time and still is in some instances to thicken foods, to texturize it. So does anybody here drink almond milk, for example? Did you read the expose in Consumers Reports on how many almonds go into actually making most of the almond milk? So then those of you who have will know that about 3 almonds lose their lives in the making of a container of almond milk. And so the rest of it is flavorings, it's texturizers, colorings, it's fake food. Proton pump inhibitors. Now we're getting into medical areas. So 50% of the people walk into my office on proton pump inhibitors. They are the fancy antacids, the little purple pill and all the other ones like them, omeprazole, pantoprazole. There's many of them on the market now. They're prescription or over the counter. The FDA about 3 years ago put a warning on them that said, do not use these for longer than 3 months. But they haven't publicized it. And they haven't really publicized, well, what's the way in which you get off of these drugs? Because they're quite addicting. And these damage the microbiome. The reason we have so much C. difficile, does everybody know C. difficile? Has everybody known somebody who's had C. difficile? Well, when I went to school, C. difficile was rare. We hardly ever saw it. And now it's all over, and it's being transmitted out in the community person to person. It never was before. We've changed it. And part of the reason we've changed it is that we've cut down stomach acid. Stomach acid is needed to kill off the bad bacteria, to help the good bacteria to survive, so it balances our microbiome. It helps our digestion to proceed. It helps with stomach emptying. So when people are on proton pump inhibitors, they usually develop something called delayed gastric emptying. And so what do? We give them another drug for that, instead of saying, hey, that's a side effect of the drug you're on. And you shouldn't be on it for this long, because it causes not only the increased incidence of food poisoning and susceptibility to C. difficile, it causes malnutrition, osteoporosis. For a while we've been wondering, why are these young men getting osteoporosis? That's not a risk group. Well, they're on PPIs because they're out there eating crappy food and taking proton pump inhibitors in order to be able to tolerate it. They're not absorbing magnesium or calcium or vitamin B12 or protein, all the building blocks of a healthy life and body. Steroids and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, that's the ibuprofens and the prescription versions of it. We have a situation where we are taking these medications because we know they're anti-inflammatories, but they're anti-inflammatories for about 15 minutes. And then they change your body chemistry and they make it inflamed by inflaming your gut, because that we now know is the key to where inflammation starts. So we have to be careful with these too. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories also have a recent warning from the FDA that they shouldn't be used wholesale, that people shouldn't stay on them regularly, that if you've had a single cardiac event, you should never take even a single dose of it again. But again, it's not widely publicized. It's tiny little print on the over-the-counter versions. And if any of you have been prescribed NSAIDs lately, did anybody talk to you about that? So we need to recognize what we're doing to the fundamentals of our health. And it doesn't mean we can't ever utilize these drugs. When these drugs are life-saving, we use them. If you have rheumatoid arthritis and you need injections of steroids into joints, or if you need systemic steroids for a life-saving asthma episode, that's very worthwhile. When drugs are life-saving, they're brilliant. In acute situations, it's brilliant. It's when it's chronic. It's when you have a sore back, a sore neck, that you're going to perpetuate the problem if you stay on these drugs. Incidentally, by decreasing your ability to heal, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories contribute to tendon tears, to failure to heal fractures, to failure to do well after surgeries, because they damage your body's ability to heal up. And toxics. So I mentioned a few of those before, things like lead, mercury, pesticides. Those do have an impact on our microbiome and our overall health. Microbiota accessible carbohydrates, MACs. And those are carbohydrates that we don't have the genes, the enzymes to make use of, to digest, but our microbiome does. And so they do it for our benefit, but they do it for their own benefit as well. So carbohydrates feed the microbiota, so we should all be eating a good, healthy, high-carb diet. They make something called short-chain fatty acids that actually help to heal up the gut when they have lots of these MACs. And so some of the things that one of the conditions that the negative things, the negative items that damage the microbiome, what they do is they cause increased intestinal permeability, which means it's called leaky gut in common parlance. What it means is things get past the gut wall that shouldn't. And once they get past the gut wall, they're there meeting the immune system. And sometimes the immune system gets very agitated and we get increased inflammation, but we can also develop autoimmunity that way. The gut is the key to autoimmunity as well. So this is the summary of epigenetics. It modifies gene expression and activity. It shuts them down or turns them on. It is heritable, as we saw in that little brown mouse, and doesn't change the fundamental DNA, and it's from environmental factors. And this was a study that showed how powerful lifestyle can be. So you can see these 4 lifestyle healthy activities that these people were screened for. And they followed this population for 7.8 years. And what they found relative to, I think they studied 23,000, and in the control group there was 45,000 people. When they studied them and compared them, the treatment group had this degree of less disease: 93% diabetes, 81% of heart attacks, 50% of strokes, and 36% of cancers. That's after 7.8 years. What happens after 15 years? We probably improve on those figures. Just think of how much suffering we can improve, how much suffering we can avoid, how much lower our healthcare costs could be. So let's talk about just a few things that you can do to help you modify inflammation. Turmeric. Turmeric is a brilliant food, and the more we research it, the better we like it. If you're using whole turmeric, you don't have to use the raw root. You can use the dried powder as well. And what it does is it has good fiber, and it is an anti-inflammatory, an antioxidant, which is a pathway to its anti-inflammatory effects. It is neuroprotective. It helps our brain make new brain cells. There's just a recent study came out 2 months ago from UCLA looking at 20 people in the control group, 20 people in the activity group, and the research group. The research group took turmeric for 18 months. The others did not. They checked their cognition beforehand, their memory tests, and they did PET scans on some of them. And they found that the treatment group had a 25% improvement in memory over the control group after 18 months of this. And they also had fewer signs of the changes that happened with dementia in their brains. Very, very significant. And it's an analgesic. So it's, as a pain doctor, it's the first one on my list for analgesia. Ginger also it's in the same family as turmeric. It's been shown to be an anti-inflammatory. They were studying it for varieties of pain. Ginger seems to have a benefit on joints, where it reverses some of the cartilage damage on joints. Now, when I went to medical school, we were taught that cartilage never heals. But the problem was we never looked for it. And we assumed it never healed, so we would do all sorts of things like knee arthroscopies at the slightest indication, and we would damage the cartilage, and then we would conclude it doesn't heal, but we weren't really giving it a chance. Once we started to look for it, we found cartilage heals. Quercetin has a couple of mechanisms to treat pain. The athletes love quercetin. It's really good for healing up and getting rid of post-activity soreness, so it can be very helpful. Cinnamon is really very nice because it gets blood sugar from the bloodstream into your cells. And by putting it into your cells, your mitochondria, which are your little energy factories, can then make energy out of it and give you more energy. And so it can combat fatigue, but it is also, because it's lowering blood sugar in a healthy way, it actually can improve diabetic control, and it can also improve cholesterol levels. Chromium and polyphenols from the cinnamon improve insulin sensitivity as well. So it helps the insulin mechanisms as well as bypasses the insulin mechanisms at the same time. Now, magnesium does a lot of wonderful things. It relaxes muscle. If you have tremors or if you have muscle cramping, night cramps are very, very common. A lot of the things that get called restless leg syndrome are just muscle cramps in the legs as a result of magnesium deficiency. And we've done, there are rat studies looking at pain as well. It is a very, very underdiagnosed and underrecognized deficiency in our culture and in our diet, even in people who are eating a fairly good diet. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but it just is. Now, you can't tell whether you're low in magnesium just by a blood test, in the same way as you can't tell if you're low in calcium just by a blood test. Your body uses your bones as reservoirs to pull magnesium and calcium from when you need it in the bloodstream. Because if the bloodstream calcium and magnesium vary by too much, you're in big trouble. You become extremely ill extremely fast. Those are life-threatening conditions. So you can become very osteoporotic from magnesium and calcium deficiency and still have normal blood levels. So magnesium affects inflammation. Insulin resistance also helps with diabetes, and it also reduces inflammation. So that last paragraph there lists a series of chemicals, naturally occurring inflammatory markers in our bodies that are improved when you take extra magnesium. Side effects are that it improves constipation. Sometimes it completely eliminates irritable bowel, helps with sleep disorders because it helps your body make serotonin and melatonin. Where is melatonin made? Do you know where melatonin is made? Which part of your body? Brain.
Gut. Biome.
Biome, exactly right. So yes, about 20% of it is made in our brain, but this is a very, very recent discovery. Over 80% of your melatonin is made in your gut. We don't know enough about it yet. It's just too new to figure out why that is, but I'm really waiting to hear that one. It helps with bone health, collagen, and if you get too much magnesium, you get diarrhea. The magnesiums, by the way, that are sold in conventional drugstores are designed to give you diarrhea, so you have to go to a good health food store and ask them for one that actually gets absorbed into your body so that it can go to your muscles, your nerves, your brain, your bones. Omega-3s, fish oils, good for as anti-inflammatories. We're going to have to find a way of generating omega-3s without killing off the oceans and the fish. And so I'm starting to be a little ambivalent about omega-3 fish oils because that is becoming an issue. Anybody who comes in to see me as a patient and they've worked with fisheries or marine biology, they chew me out for that one. So, we're going to have to come up with a way with other sources of omega-3s. And I'm sure at some point we'll be able to generate them through bacterial artificial creation. And so this is the dose that's been studied for pain. You don't need quite that much just for general health. It's good for brain health. It's good for developing brains in pregnancy and in babies. Omega-3s are very important. And this is just a little bit of research on it. So basically, I'm into the business of health creation as opposed to our current healthcare model, which is a disease management model. And so we need to look for ways of staying healthy because it saves the trouble of being sick and then being treated. You don't need to have a diagnosis. We need whole person care. We need time and attention. That's really one of the major ways our health system needs to change. We need to give people time to go through what their story is. The silver bullet model, which works great for acute medicine, is just not cutting it when it comes to chronic medicine. And we need to pay attention to those connectors. So, Are we looking for answers in the right places? Okay, so what we eat, drink, think, feel, and do is the bottom line. It has more influence on our health than what we've inherited, and certainly more influence on health than drugs, other than in life-saving conditions. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yes?
What's the serving size of those, like the cinnamon, turmeric, ginger?
The cinnamon studies have been done on half a teaspoon of cinnamon per day. Turmeric, it depends on what you're taking it for. So and I apologize, I don't have the dosage that they used in the UCLA study. I forget that. Do you know what that is? No? Okay. When I'm treating pain patients, I like them to get about 3 grams per day of turmeric powder. Because in the large studies that are called systematic reviews, that seems to be where you get consistently good, robust results, even though you do get positive results with much lower doses. So I have them start there and then see how they feel with that and then lower the dose as they go.
What's in teaspoons, 3 grams, do you know?
About a flat teaspoon's about 2 grams, so about a teaspoon and a half. And I recommend it as something called golden milk. If you go to my website, you'll see a recipe for golden milk. You can look it up on YouTube. And it's a way of making a turmeric paste. Personally, I believe that Ayurvedic medicine is really onto something. That heating activates the turmeric. And that taking it in that form is actually extremely beneficial. And then ginger. So the ginger studies were done on standardized preparations of ginger with 500 milligrams of gingerols. So the pill might be 750 containing 500 milligrams of gingerols. That's what the research was done.
I'm sorry, did you say ginger oil?
Gingerol, Gingerol. Gingerol. So it's just that's a derivative of that's a segment of what's in ginger.
Oh, I see. What if you were to eat fresh ginger?
Fresh ginger, I don't know. I haven't seen studies on that, and I haven't experimented with it myself. I do use it. What I like to do actually is make I take cinnamon sticks, which are cinnamon through and through. I put them into water, hot water, just to make the cinnamon all soft. It then releases a lot of sweetness and cinnamony flavor. So if you like cinnamon, it works. And I use that as a hot tea or a cold tea, and I will often chop ginger and put it in there. And so that becomes kind of a thing that I keep in my fridge. The ginger will continue many pitchers full of releases of that ginger, because as I say, it is ginger through and through, and if you keep it in the water, it just keeps releasing it until you stop tasting it, then you refresh it. Yes? Pardon me?
I've been told that if you soak your feet in Epsom salts, you actually absorb the magnesium into your body. Is that correct?
Yes. This is the question about soaking in Epsom salts. You can soak your feet, you can soak your body, take an Epsom salts bath. You will absorb it. If you add some baking soda to it, you will absorb more of the magnesium. So yeah, that's very helpful.
Excuse me. What's the difference between inflammation, or what's the relation between inflammation and water retention?
Well, from the old definition of inflammation, which is red, hot, swollen, for one thing, it's part of the reaction of the tissue's blood flow in areas of inflammation increases. Now that's acute inflammation. So what we're talking about here mostly is chronic inflammation, but it activates some of the same mediators, some of the inflammatory chemicals in our body that calls in some of our immune cells, which then release substances that call fluids in, and so we do get increased fluid when there is inflammation, but it's not as obvious as when you have, a sliver and it gets red hot and swollen, or you have gout. Yes?
I'm a little alarmed with young girls with acne. they're, because of all this about antibiotics, they're prescribing, putting them on birth control, and I wondered if they're, do you know anything about that side of it, the birth control, what it's doing?
Yeah, hormones also adversely affect the microbiome, and I mean, that's getting into a vast topic that's really too complex to really get into well here. I think that if they would look at what those girls are eating and make sure it's a clean diet with a minimum amount of pesticides, that they see whether they can tolerate all different types of foods, that a lot of those people would not have acne. I mean, in my practice, I've treated a variety of conditions with diet. Acne is the first one. From the time I started practice, I said, your face is a major detox organ. What are you detoxing from? And I got a lot of pushback from dermatology where I was practicing, but I also had a lot of success. In those days, I was also saying, I mean, I started practice in 1984, and I was saying if you have an inflammatory bowel disease or an irritable bowel disease, whether it's Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, what are you eating? Let's put you on a clean diet. And I actually had patients who were fired by their gastroenterologists for following those instructions. I never told them to come off their drugs. I said, continue with your gastroenterologist. We're just going to see how good you can get. Many of them were then able to come off their drugs. Many of them were able to avoid surgery. And now, of course, the gastroenterology has very much come on board and is very much interested in looking at what people eat and recognizing the microbiome. I mean, their specialty has dramatically changed with the research on the microbiome. Yes?
You had a slide that suggested we should eat alkaline diets, and I was wondering how that, should you avoid low pH foods like tomatoes and maybe kombucha to drink, explain that.
Okay, so alkaline diet, explain that. Okay. So you asked specifically about tomatoes and kombucha. Tomatoes are part of a class of foods called the nightshades. Tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, peppers, tobacco also in there. They are acidifying foods. There's another subgroup of people that has problems with those foods, with nightshades. This was discovered in the veterinary population. Veterinarians discovered that there was a problem for their animals, for cows in particular. And then it took us about 30 years after that to finally say, gee, I wonder if people are affected too. So some people are, and they get arthritic from it. So those I'm going to leave aside. Kombucha, problem with kombucha is it's full of sugar, so you have to be careful with kombucha, but certainly fermented foods are helpful. So let's talk about what makes up an alkaline diet. It's a plant-based diet. So it doesn't mean you can't have any meat, but meat is acidifying. Most protein is acidifying, but animal protein more than vegetable protein. So beef is worse than pork, which is worse than poultry, which is worse than fish. So fish of the flesh foods is the least acidifying. Vegetable proteins are also somewhat acidifying, but there's a variation within them, and you can get charts of the acidifying level of different foods. Lentils, for example, are one of the stellar foods in decreasing body-wide acidity. But beans are not so much, and yet they're very closely related. So it's the effect of the food on the body. So things like apple cider vinegar, which is acidic, and lemon juice, which is acidic, are alkalinizing to our body. And it's because they make our kidneys excrete a lot of acid.
How about yogurt?
Yogurt is, the beneficial bacteria in yogurt are good. There will be, because it's animal protein, there is some acidity involved in that. So yogurt is the one food that when you look around the world is the most, in cultures that do take dairy, yogurt is probably the most consistent one that they take. There's very few cultures where after childhood, after infancy, people drink milk. And the majority of the world doesn't use dairy products at all.
What do you think of drinking milk? Is that good or bad? Because I have little kids, don't know whether they should give this to them.
Yeah, well, the majority of the world after infancy doesn't drink milk. So we have, if you look at the food diagrams, if you look at the food pyramid, I mean, that was abysmal. That was 11 servings of grains at the bottom, which was the highest bulk of what our food should be, and they didn't say anything about it being whole grains. So that could have been Twinkies. Now, when they've come up with My Plate, they did a little bit of a better job. They've reduced the amount of grains, but they say only half should be whole grains, which means the other half on a daily basis can be Twinkies. But they've always had this obligatory milk, dairy. Why?
Is it a good
It's-
source of calcium? Because I hear different things.
You know, vegetables are a really good source of calcium. The nations that have most osteoporosis are the most milk-drinking nations. So we don't know, I mean, we can't say that that's cause and effect, that's an association. But there are, milk is the perfect food, is what I was taught in grade school. I had to recite it. But as I learned later, milk is the perfect food for cow babies, not for us. It's oversold. And so I'm not saying no milk, but I'm also saying the whole issue of calcium was skewed by the research, which was done on calcium. Back in the 1960s, there were two paths towards osteoporosis when they recognized osteoporosis. One was looking at calcium and the other was looking at vitamin D. And the drug companies were developing drugs to put calcium back into your bones, they thought, the bisphosphonates. There's no money in vitamin D. So all the research went towards calcium and vitamin D was forgotten. And vitamin D deficiency is a major source of deficiency in bone development and bone maintenance. So is vitamin C. So most mammals make their own vitamin C. Primates are one of the few parts of the animal phyla that do not make our own vitamin C. Now, a rat makes about 10 grams a day. That's 10,000 milligrams a day of vitamin C. When they're under stress, they make 10 times that amount. Now, we're not rats. When you look at goats who have a closer physiology to us and a closer weight to us, rats, by the way, are average 4 pounds. Goats are around our weight. And so they make less than that, less than 10 grams. But they still make in the gram level of it. And what's being prescribed for us by our regulatory agencies are milligram doses of it. And when you look at us from an evolutionary perspective, we were born in the cradle of the Olduvai Gorge and the Syrian African Rift. There was lots of sun, there was lots of citrus. That's where our genetics began, and they've changed very little since then. So we probably need more vitamin C as well, and I'm not saying mega doses, but we probably need more than what is being recommended, and it is a factor in collagen formation. Collagen is the structure, the framework for our bones.